Ian Buruma obviously doesn't really need an introduction, I think, to most of us. He's a very frequent contributor to New York Review of Books, New Yorker, Corriere della Sera magazine in Italy, the NRC Handelsblad, among other things. He has published more than 12 books. He got his degree at the University of Leiden, which makes me proud since that's my old stomping grounds as well. Then he went on to a Japanese university, Nihon University, to take a postgraduate scholarship in Japanese cinema. So obviously a very diverse and very well-rounded scholar who also speaks 6 languages. Has published 12 books. Some of you will know his book on the murder of Theo van Gogh and the political consequences for religious toleration in the Netherlands. Today he'll expand on that topic with his new book, which we have at the back and will be available for signing if you're interested. I should also note that he is the winner of the Erasmus Prize in 2008. And the Erasmus Prize is not that well known in the United States, but is one of the most prestigious awards in Europe, where scholars who have made great contributions to the study of culture, society, and social science. So someone who's very well known in Europe and the United States. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Ian Buruma, and please join me in welcoming him. We'll talk about the topic of religion on 3 continents. Ian, thank you very much for coming.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me. If you see me sniffing and reaching for tissues, it's because I've got, like millions of others, a rather nasty cold. But I very much appreciate being here. The title of my book, Taming the Gods, might suggest a certain hostility towards organized religion. I am hostile to certain aspects of organized religion, but not to religion as such. I don't share the view that some aggressive atheists take, that religion is something that really ought to be abolished, or even that religion can be abolished. But I should probably put my cards on the table. I don't really have an axe to grind with any organized religion myself. I come from an utterly lapsed, a doubly lapsed household. My father was the son of a Mennonite minister in Holland, and the Mennonites in Holland are not at all the same thing as the Mennonites here. In fact, it's the most ecumenical, most progressive, liberal form of Protestantism in Holland, which gave rise to some misunderstandings when American Mennonites would occasionally come and visit my grandfather, and sort of men in black suits and beards turned up. But like many sons and daughters of men of the cloth, my father became a convinced atheist. My mother comes from a Jewish family, but the kind of family that Adam Gopnik once described as their Jewishness showed itself in the ostentatiousness with which they celebrated Christmas. My grandparents would have a bigger Christmas tree than any of the goyim in the neighborhood. And so I didn't really grow up with any religion myself, which I don't know whether to count myself fortunate or not. Fortunate, perhaps, in many ways, because it was a free atmosphere. Unfortunate in that sometimes it's good to have something to resist. The great movies of Fellini and Buñuel would not have existed without them having grown up as Roman Catholics. And the ignorance is something else that I regret, that when I do occasionally take part in a religious occasion, I have much too little idea of what's really going on, which I think is actually a pity. In any case, I grew up at a time in Holland, and this is sometimes forgotten by people who describe Europe as this great secularized continent compared to the United States, filled with religious mania. In the 1960s in the Netherlands, religion was still in the air. If you switched on the radio on Sundays, almost every program would be taken up by preachers, ministers, pastors, priests of one kind or another holding sermons. The collapse of organized faith and the authority of the various churches really only occurred in the 1960s. So the view that America, that one of the fundamental differences between Western Europe and America is the lack of religion in Europe and the abundance of it in the United States, is not necessarily, does not necessarily have a strong historical basis. But that is very much the sort of the liberal European view now of the United States, that the US is fundamentally different in Europe because of religion, guns, and the death penalty. And of course these are all linked in common perceptions of the United States. But I think there is a much bigger difference which cuts across the Western world in modern times. But by modern times I don't mean just the 20th and 21st century, which is really the difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, which I do think is profound. And it was Tocqueville, when he was traveling through the United States, coming, of course, from a Catholic country, albeit after the Revolution in France, but who remarked quite rightly that whereas freedom and religion in Europe often seem to be running in opposite directions, in America he saw them being very much in tandem. And I think that was, and the other remark he made was that Europeans who resist organized religion often see religion, don't do so because they oppose religion as such. They oppose the church as an institution that was usually very much in league with secular power. And in the United States, of course, it was rather different, that very quickly the established organized religions were eclipsed by various evangelical and Baptist faiths, which took a very different political course than was true in Europe. And I think that difference is still marked, that what people in Europe rebelled against in the 1960s, everywhere, in Italy and in Catholic countries as well as in Protestant countries, but it was very much the established churches. It was the churches as institutions of authority, political authority, much more than against religion as such, which is also why I'm not at all convinced that this difference between secularized Europe and religious America will necessarily hold in the future. I'm not so sure that religion may not make a comeback in Europe, but it's unlikely to mean a comeback of the Catholic Church or the Calvinist Church or the Lutherans. It's more likely to be some form of evangelical faith, which is becoming popular all over the world. And indeed, the nervousness with which the Catholic Church is reacting to this phenomenon is evident. And there was a jamboree for young, especially organized for young people in Germany a few years ago by the Catholic Church, where the Pope appeared, and it had all the style, really, of an evangelical meeting rather than a traditional Catholic one. So I think there is that difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, and as I said, I think the secularization of Europe should be seen relatively and as a recent phenomenon. When people talk about a threat to democracy, which is after all the subject of my book, in Europe now, they really don't mean the Christian church anymore, or the Christian churches, let alone Judaism. They, of course, talk about Islam. That is the fundamental, it's seen as the fundamental challenge to secularism and to democracy in Europe. And this was, of course, triggered by immigration, but particularly by violent acts of political Islamist extremism. The bombings in Madrid, in London, the murder of Theo van Gogh, Theo van Gogh, and that combined with the tensions that always arise from immigration, and certain problems that come with mass immigration are relatively new to many Europeans. And what this has led to, really, is a confusion, in my view, between different things which shouldn't really be automatically linked. The confusion is between, and people tend to see these things as somehow part of the same threat. They tend to think of all these things as though these are the same, and I think it's a dangerous form of confusion because it leads to overreaction, aggressive populism, discrimination, and so on. Then there is another form of another challenge, if you like, from religious sources to modern democratic secular society, which is not, which is very different. Well, it's not different, but doesn't arise from monotheistic religion. I think it's a misunderstanding, and a common misunderstanding, to assume that somehow the problems of religious orthodoxy, political religion, and so on, are something typical of monotheism, something that's typical of Islam, of Christianity, and perhaps even Judaism, and that polytheistic societies are much more, are rather immune to these kind of problems. This is actually not true. I think if you look at the history of the Far East, of China and Japan, but also other places, you'll see that the tensions between secular authority and religious authority can be just as severe. And a good example of politicized religious violence has been in Japan from the Aum Shinrikyo, one of the many so-called new religions that became especially common after World War II in Japan. And you probably remember that some years ago, the Aum Shinrikyo, acting out of a sort of a mishmash of half-baked Hindu and Buddhist beliefs, following a cultish, half-blind, long-haired leader, put sarin poison gas in the Tokyo subway system, hoping that by destroying the materialistic, spiritually empty, corrupt modern society of Japan, an apocalypse would occur, after which heaven on earth would be established by the members of Aum Shinrikyo. What was especially disturbing to many people is that many followers of the Aum Shinrikyo and its leader, Asahara Shoko, were actually scientists of one kind or another, highly educated people from the world of exact sciences, engineers, people in computers, chemists, and so on and so forth. People who felt that somehow this wasn't enough, that society needed a spiritual dimension, and they were led astray by this violent movement. Now, what are the real dangers of religion when we think of liberal democracy, when we think of our societies? What is the threat? Now, clearly, to have a functioning liberal democracy, it's a good thing to separate church from state. As soon as the authority of the church usurps the authority of secular politics, you have a severe problem. Theocracies can almost by definition not be democracies. In fact, if you look at the modern world, theocracies are exceedingly rare. People often talk about the Middle East as though the Middle Eastern politics are being screwed up by Islam, as though Middle Eastern governments are all run by Islamists. Of course, the contrary is true. In Iran, there's been a theocratic revolution. But even there, things are not so simple as we see today in the tensions that exist there with certain clerics opposing other clerics. I mean, there is certainly no uniformity among the religious authorities. But Iran has been rather rare, and the attempts of the Ayatollah Khomeini to be the political leader not only of Iran but of the Islamic world at large have failed. And even amongst the Shiites, there's a lot of opposition to what the Ayatollah did after the revolution in Iran, which is to behave like a secular dictator, which was not the traditional role of an Ayatollah at all. And in many ways, Khomeini behaved more like a Mussolini-type figure than he did like an autocratic pope. And this was not at all well received, even among Shiites. So the total usurpation of secular authority by religious authority is actually highly rare. If we look at the differences between the United States and Europe, which is part of my book, there is an interesting phenomenon, I think, which is that the separation of church and state in the US historically has been much sharper and much clearer than it has been in Europe. At the same time, there has been far more religious believers. There's far more religious activity in the United States, despite that fact. Jefferson already ran up against this tension in the U.S. That he, of course, a man of the Enlightenment, wanted to have a very clear separation of church and state, and he already, in his time, there were voices that felt that secularists, that Jefferson in particular, had robbed the United States of its Christian identity, and that the United States should be a Christian country, and that the founding fathers had robbed the U.S. of this status, from its sacred roots. Now, Tocqueville saw that, or thought that religion was actually an essential component of liberal democracy in the United States and elsewhere, and he worried about the erosion of religion in Europe. And he thought that if you have political freedom, or the more political freedom you have, the more people, in terms of moral behavior, should be bound by religion, because religion was essential as the kind of moral glue that would hold the people together, especially in countries where there was a large degree of political authority. He thought that otherwise, without that moral glue, things would disintegrate. Now, this is a notion that you still find. You find it amongst Christian Democrats, of course, in Europe, who think that there has to be a sort of Christian spiritual dimension to politics, without which society will become arid, immoral, nihilistic, and so on. You find it amongst some of the more interesting Islamic thinkers today. And one of the hate figures for those who see Islam as a great threat to European politics, to European democracy today, is Tariq Ramadan, born in Switzerland, scion of a religious family. His father was the disciple of the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood. His brother is the representative of the Muslim Brotherhood in Europe, and Tariq Ramadan calls himself a Salafist. He is an Orthodox Muslim. But what he also does, or wants, or says he wants, is to reconcile Islam, Orthodox Islam, with being a democratic, a citizen of a liberal democracy in a modern European country. He does not want a separate, a kind of society within a society of Muslim believers. What he wants is actually very much what certain Christians want. He wants to use his faith, his orthodox faith, his orthodoxy, to inject a spiritual dimension into what he sees as an over-secularized society which has lost its spiritual dimension, which has lost its spiritual roots. Now, there may be a lot wrong with Tariq Ramadan, but I think in some ways he is the solution to certain problems that we're having now in Europe in trying to integrate religious believers, and in this case Muslims, and integrate them into European societies as citizens, as democratic citizens. It seems to me a more hopeful sign to have somebody who wants to find some way in which people can combine religious belief with being good democratic citizens than somebody who rejects liberal democratic society as somehow sinful. And one of the more hopeful signs I saw when I researched several years ago a book on the murder of Theo van Gogh called Murder in Amsterdam was at Leiden University. And I went there to interview a Dutchman of Iranian origin. He was a refugee from the Iranian Revolution. He came to Holland from Afghanistan and teaches law at Leiden. And I had lunch with him in the canteen. And this Iranian, who comes from the left in Iran, the Tudeh party, has a real axe to grind with Islam, hates everything about Islam, and is one of the people who's warning the Dutch and Europeans in general about the great threat to Western values from Islam. And he was explaining how dangerous Islam was, that there was no such thing as moderate Muslims. They were all equally bad. It was something that really had to be kept firmly under control, because otherwise liberal democracy in the Netherlands and elsewhere would collapse. And as he was explaining this to me, I was looking around in the canteen of the law faculty of Leiden, and I saw all these young women with headscarves, daughters of immigrants largely, studying law. And to me this seemed actually a very hopeful sign, because if young women with headscarves, who clearly wear them as a sign of their faith, who want to be good Muslims, are also working hard to study law, it shows that that people are actually trying to bridge the gap between secular society between democracy and their faith, rather than rejecting it. So I think, if anything, this bodes well, without me being a great champion of headscarves of any other expression of religion, which would be the height of hypocrisy for somebody who doesn't hold any faith himself. The idea that we need a kind of faith to hold things together exists, of course, in many ways, and not just in the form of traditional organized religion. We have such a thing as civic religion, and it's interesting that the two countries that have had democratic revolutions in the Western world, the United States and France, both have notions of a civic religion. In the United States it's obvious and often commented on. In France it's perhaps less obvious, but I would argue that they also have a sense of civic religion, a kind of substitute for the Catholic Church that the revolutionaries in the 18th century tried to overthrow. Rousseau, one of the main thinkers behind the French Revolution, of course, proposed the idea that the country needed a civic religion to hold society together after the revolution. I think it explains why in France, perhaps more than in other European countries, such issues as wearing headscarves in public places and so on are so hot. In Britain, nobody particularly cares that bus conductors, Sikh bus conductors, wear turbans, or young Muslim women wear headscarves. The burqa, of course, is a slightly different issue. In certain jobs, it would be difficult to have women in burqa. In certain jobs, you need to be able to see people's faces. But on the whole, people are far more tolerant to the display of religious symbols in public places than they are in France. And I think one of the reasons, apart from the fact that in France they have laws to this effect, banning these things in public schools and so on, I think the reason is that in France laïcité, secularism, really has become a kind of civic faith, a religion, a dogma, which means that those who wear a headscarf seem to be challenging another faith rather than anything else. And not only that, but the French Revolution saw quite rightly the authority of the Church, the Catholic Church, as one of the things that had to go if a republic was going to be at all successful. And I think that this is, again, the difference between Protestant cultures and Catholic ones. And so the idea of having a secular space, of banning the display of religious symbols in public places, really originated in a fear of the Catholic clergy regaining its old authority, and which is now used against young women who are members of a minority, which pose no threat to the established order at all, really. But apart from the civic religions, the European countries, of course, have not separated church and faith nearly as strongly as is the case in the United States. If you look at Britain, it still has an established church with the monarch at the head of the church, and you still have a mixed government. 26 so-called spiritual lords, members of the Anglican Church, still sit in the House of Lords. And I think this comes from the late Enlightenment, men like Locke and Hume and so on, who in Britain really thought of religion, the church, like the monarchy, as an institution that was necessary to keep society together, and you couldn't have a complete separation of secular and religious society. The church became a kind of cultural institution, something that was necessary because it was a pillar of society rather than a source of a religious dogma. It doesn't really matter whether in Anglicanism whether you believe in God or not, as long as you take part in the ceremonies. There is an extreme version of this in French, in French conservative thinking, and I think the best example of this is Joseph Maistre, who was an extreme reactionary, but still very much a product of the Enlightenment himself, in the sense that if after the Enlightenment religion is no longer the source of truth, of good and bad, of morality, and so on. If there is no revealed truth anymore, you have to do something to keep people under control. Now, those who believe in liberalism think that there is a liberal solution to this, that people follow their enlightened self-interest and so on. If you are opposed to that idea, if you're frightened that you'll have chaos and disorder as soon as you don't have a moral authority, you still need the church, which is why Maistre, who himself was not really a believer, believed that the church was necessary simply because it exerted authority, just as he thought it was necessary to have an absolute monarch, because otherwise people would run riot. Now, this is not quite the way it is that Hume thought of it, or other conservative members of the late Enlightenment in Britain. But the idea that religious institutions are still necessary, even if you don't really believe, I think is still there in Britain. Holland and Germany, the separation between church and state is not absolute either. In Germany, every citizen has to pay a religious tax to support churches and faith-based education and so on. Holland has its so-called Article 23 of the Constitution, which means that faith-based schools will be subsidized by the government, in other words, out of taxpayers' money as well. And you still, in both countries, both Holland and Germany, the majority parties are still Christian Democrats. Now, there is a parallel, and again, this is, I think, a Protestant phenomenon rather than a Catholic one. There is a parallel in Dutch history with American Protestant history, in that one of the fathers of the Calvinist, of the Protestant pillar of Dutch society, Abraham Kuyper, a name that American evangelicals are quite familiar with, perhaps more familiar with than most Dutch people these days. He believed, he was a 19th century statesman, and was the founder of the so-called anti-revolutionary party. And the revolution, of course, was the French Revolution. And Kuyper believed that the true people, the true Dutch people, were Protestants, Calvinists. They'd fought Spain in the War of Independence. They were the true Volk, as it were. And liberals, socialists, even Catholics were not really the true members of the Dutch Volk. And, but he had to live with the fact that these people were fellow citizens. And so, in effect, what happened in Holland is that he and the Calvinist party became great promoters of the separation between church and state, but for the same reasons that the American Protestants were promoters of the separation of church and state. And the difference, I think, between that on the one hand and Catholic France on the other is that in the United States, the separation took place to, and in Calvinist Holland, to protect religion from the secular state, whereas in France, the separation took place to protect the state from the power of religion. And these are really two very different things. And again, I think it shows the differences between Catholicism and Protestantism much more than between the new and the old world. Perhaps, and I will conclude with that, the real danger to secular liberal democracy from religion does not come from any specific faith so much. I think the challenge is really something that my friend and co-author Avishai Margalit, the philosopher, called the difference between religious politics and economic politics. It's an attitude, perhaps more than anything that is specific to one particular faith. And the difference between religious politics and economic politics are as follows. That religious politics is anything that posits, that sees politics as something that leads to a form of redemption, that has a utopian goal based on a dogma and a sense of absolute truth, which is non-negotiable. A faith in a redemptive future, a future redemption. Whereas economic politics is really about interests. And you give a little bit on this side, the other side gives you a little bit to you. It's a question of horse trading of interests, material interests mostly. Now, no system is 100% religious in this sense, and no system is 100% economic. You could argue that the United States is a good example of a place where economic politics, the economic attitude to politics, predominate. But even in the United States, there is still enough idealism, there are still enough even millenarian Christian roots, enough sense of a national mission to lead the world to some redemptive future of freedom, to temper, I think, a society which would be completely dominated by economic politics. And even theocracies usually have some room for economic politics as well. But the problem, I think, with religious politics is that it's almost impossible, and that is the problem, of course, when it comes to functioning democracy. It becomes almost impossible to compromise. If you have the religious attitude, the religious mind, and that goes for secular religions just as much as for traditional organized faith. It's true of communists as much as it is of Orthodox Christians or Muslims, that those who dissent, who take a different view, can only do so, from your point of view, because they're stupid or ignorant or acting in bad faith. Because after all, if there is an absolute truth, then dissent from that idea of the absolute truth cannot be in good faith, or it's based on ignorance. And this means that there cannot be interests or even value, let alone values, that may be equally valid in their own way, but are still in conflict, in which case only a political compromise, only a form of horse trading can find a solution. But to the religious mind, this is, of course, an impossibility, because any form of compromise, any form of finding some common ground, corrupts the pure faith. It dilutes the idea of the absolute truth. So the big question today, I think, when we talk about the functioning of liberal democracy, and especially the challenge posed by Orthodox belief, and in Europe that now means Islam rather than Christianity, the big challenge is to what extent those who take this religious view of politics, this redemptive view of politics, and have a strong belief in absolute truth, to what extent they will be able to compromise enough to become fully functioning citizens of modern democracies. My view is that it is possible. After all, even Islamic parties are engaging in democratic politics fairly successfully. If you look at Indonesia, Turkey, India, and so on, the fact that politics are not that democracies are not functioning very well in the Middle East is one thing, but India and Indonesia have the largest Muslim populations in the world, and there it seems to be functioning perfectly well. So I think it is possible, just as it's possible to have communist parties functioning as part of democracies, it is possible to have religious parties that function perfectly well. And what is necessary, of course, the necessary compromise that all these parties agree to play by common rules. They don't need to have similar values, but they have to agree to play by common rules. And I think one of the things that is poisoning the political discourse in some European countries today is this notion, quite common in my own native country, it has to be said, where a strongly anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant populist politician has just done very well in municipal elections and might even become the biggest party in the country in June, is this notion that you cannot integrate people as citizens if they don't share exactly the same values. That this notion that conflicting values or different values cannot exist among citizens of the same country. And I think that in itself is a sign of the religious view of politics, which makes compromise extremely difficult. Now, I think you cannot really argue with the religious faith as such. Some people try, but I think it's a rather fruitless exercise to use reason to argue against the existence of God or to argue against a faith. A faith is by definition not reasonable. It's a fact. It's a belief, after all. It's not something that can be rationally argued, even though some people have attempted to do so. So I think that's a rather fruitless exercise. But I do think that religious values, we know that religious values can inform politics, and that can be rationally discussed. As an example, I would take somebody like Martin Luther King, whose ideas on civil rights, for him, clearly were informed by his religious faith. But the conclusions he drew from that, the civil rights movement, his views on all kinds of politics, could very well be rationally discussed. And it didn't really matter what the source was of these views. So there's no need to share same values. There's no need to ban religious expression in public, whatever it is. All that is necessary is that we impose common rules, laws in particular. Now the problem with that is that laws themselves, of course, to some extent, reflect values. No country has laws that are totally separate from the values that go into it, which is why the law tends to be relatively conservative. You can't leave too many people behind whose values may conflict with the law. And this causes problems, not only in America, although America, I think, occasionally has extreme forms of this. Problems such as birth control, abortion, euthanasia, and even inoculation. For example, in the Netherlands, there is a strict Calvinist community where people feel that their faith forbids them from inoculating their children against smallpox. Now, these are serious problems. In my view, as Isaiah Berlin would describe it, the negative liberty of those who wish the right to have the right to abortion, or under certain circumstances euthanasia or birth control, should not be robbed of them because by those who wish to have the positive liberty to ban those things because of their faith. I think people should have those rights, and those who do not want to avail themselves of them need not. Inoculation is perhaps, in some ways, perhaps the trickiest, because the state would, because of concern of general health, have to impose something on people, even though it may not be part of their faith. But so be it. Religious orthodoxy, those who feel particularly strongly about it, about their religion, can always opt to drop out, of course. The Amish, the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, and there are others. But by dropping out, they do not really pose a serious threat to the secular order or religious or liberal democracy. As long as they don't want to destroy the society that they may see as sinful, as long as they simply wish to drop out, one can live with that. The danger, the real thing, and the one thing that really cannot be tolerated in any circumstances is the threat of violence or the use of violence to impose views on others, whether they're religious or anything else. Now, in some ways, the hero of my book is Spinoza, who lived at a time in Holland when the church and the state did impose views on minorities and did have the authority to do so. And he, though not a religious man and kicked out of the church of his own parents, the Sephardic Jewish community of Amsterdam, he was not a religious man. His view on religion, however, was not that of a dogmatic atheist either. He felt that religion was perfectly good if it made people behave well and peacefully. People should be free to believe whatever they wish, or not to believe, but the church should not have any political say. The religion should not be, and the religion should be entirely controlled by the secular authorities, and it should not stand in the way of rational inquiry. What he essentially said, and I will conclude with that, is that God cannot be banned. Gods can only be tamed. Thank you very much.
Professor Buruma will field his own question, so if you just want to raise your hand, we'll acknowledge you and proceed from there.
Yes.
visiting the border south, and with visiting my parents, there are a class of people, or I'm not sure how prevalent it is, but completely abandoned their economic interests because President Obama is African American. And then Morris Dees has documented that there is a rise of hate groups, and it seems that their values too are just completely rejecting their economic interests. And I was wondering how you see those, given your dichotomy, or your continuum there.
The question for those who didn't hear it is, if I could, correct me if I don't paraphrase it right, but that people in the South in particular,
Well, that's where I have contact.
right, ignore their economic interests because they're so filled with loathing of the current administration, in particular of President Obama being an African American. Well, I would say about that the same that I would say about people who hold extreme religious views. They're welcome to their views, even though one may not agree with them, as long as they don't impose them on others by the use of violence. I don't think that those views should be banned, nor is it always... It's a very common thing that is said by nice liberals like us about people who are often economically less privileged, that somehow they have absolutely no... they seem to be perversely going against their own economic interests, and they take things like abortion and so on more seriously. It's not always so straightforward what people's interests are. So I think one should probably be a bit careful of that argument. But I think the danger is of hate groups of any kind is that it is when it unleashes violence. And legally, of course, in America, there's a lot more leeway to expressing these views than there would be in European countries, where the First Amendment doesn't apply. And you can say far more here than you can in Europe. The interesting thing about that, to me, is that, and maybe that's something that Tocqueville also observed, is that even though the laws in America on free speech and freedom of expression are much more lenient than in Europe, in practice, Americans tend to be much more restrained in their expression than Europeans are. And I think there is a correlation there, that as long as people feel that the law is not an instrument, primarily an instrument used by those in power to control the common people, people can exercise a lot of self-restraint. Whereas in countries, in France, I think is a fairly good example, where there's a common perception that somehow the law is something, or China, is something that the authorities use to control the people. The first opportunity to get to rebel or thwart the law, you'll do so. And I think that so I'm rather a First Amendmentalist in that sense. Yes?
Thanks. I wanted to put a little pressure back on the way you were, on two parts of the talk that come together. The way you were defining secularism in Europe as sort of an absence, as a place of deliberative space, as opposed to the presence of something. And the account of the arrival of North Africans and Muslims to Europe, although as putting a challenge on this kind of absent space of deliberation. So let me just clarify that a little bit. A lot of the, as you know, of course, a lot of the Enlightenment thinkers that you were referring to, or a lot of those Enlightenment ideas, could have fueled the European colonization of the same countries that led to the reverse immigration of some people who spoke languages
Yeah.
Or in the case of Iran, for example, the rise of Khomeini was kind of a counter-response to the Western-supported Shah's regime, well known to Iranians, of course, as part of what fueled that collision of interests. So I very much appreciate the way you wanted to distinguish Muslims, North African Arab Muslims in France as being these separate sorts of groups. On the one hand, there could be, cultural values, religious values, and then extremists. That could be one part of it. On the one hand, but I still worry that what that takes away from the discussion is a sense that Muslims too, cultural Muslims, hijab is not always an expression of faith.
Mm-hmm.
It's a style, it's a fashion, it's a norm, certainly in South of the Mediterranean.
Mm-hmm.
Could then therefore end up seeming like irrational. I know this is not your intention. I don't think it's your intention. Against the kind of absence of irrationality in Europe. I mean, the discussion around the headscarf in France seems to most American observers completely irrational, because no one speaks of the wearing of the crucifix as a sign of religion, the cross on top of the Pantheon as a sign of religious expression in France. It's only the opposed religions that somehow seem religious. I mean, I think that's sympathetic to what you're saying, because you know that law is the expression of society. Very Durkheimian point.
Yes, well, two things. First of all, I'm not sure that is quite true, because I think that the allergy of French secularists to religious symbols did express itself in hostility to the Catholic Church as well. After all, the last 100 years, there's been a kind of, until really the end of World War II, there's been a civil war in France simmering under the surface between the secularists and those who still saw the Catholic Church as a source of moral behavior. And so people are opposed to, although it does occur in France, that you do sometimes see the cross in classrooms and so on. A lot of people are very, very much against that. And the laws against the hijab include the display of any other religious symbols, even though I agree with you that the reason for those laws to be tightened has everything to do with the Islamic presence and not because of any greater fear of the Catholic Church. But so I don't think it's simply anti-Islamism or Islamophobia. On the hijab, no, I agree with you. I don't think it's always irrational. In North Africa, it was often in Morocco, I think Algeria, it was often educated, when it was still run by France, it was educated women who wore the hijab as a kind of defiance of colonial authority. And it can also be a cultural symbol, a symbol of identity. The more pressure that's put on the minorities in France or anywhere else, the more defensively people will start adopting that kind of thing. On the other hand, there are also, of course, women who are forced to do it because otherwise they may be gang raped in slums and so on. So I think it's a mixture there. I mean, sometimes it's voluntary, sometimes it's not. Sometimes people will take it off as soon as they're out of sight of their parents. Sometimes the parents don't particularly want them to wear it, but the women themselves want to. So I think it's a very mixed picture. The assumption that it's all forced, which you get from a lot of people on the left, feminists and so on, is certainly incorrect. The assumption, on the other hand, that it's all a wonderful form of identity and defiance and free will is also incorrect. Now, how to deal with it by law, I would personally, I'm not a great fan of the rather dogmatic French attitude to this, that you should ban it as much as possible. I think people should probably, even though some people might be forced to do these things, you should probably err on the side of negative liberty. But as to your point, no, it was not my intention to present it as something that was an irrational element in otherwise a rational environment. And I think maybe I'm repeating myself a little bit, but I think there is a difference between the secular condition, which is the state where the authority of the church and secular authority is kept separate, which is true in more or less in all liberal democracies, and secularism, which makes a dogma out of the secular and becomes almost another form of faith. And I think that's something that is much more marked in France than it is in other countries, even though I think those who are now using the Enlightenment and so-called Enlightenment values against the religious, in particular Muslims, but not only Muslims, can be just as dogmatic in that quote-unquote faith as the religious can. And the Enlightenment, I think, is bandied about in discussion now in a way that is highly dogmatic and actually rather against the best ideas of the Enlightenment. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, it does. And just to respond, I mean, just as a rhetorical gesture, when you park, you try to make that to a tripartite distinction, which is good. The effect can also be, though, to equate Muslims in Muslim-majority nations with religious extremism. As you know from south of the Mediterranean, while it may be 99% Muslim, there's a lot more going on with
Absolutely.
Muslim identity. And so
Absolutely.
there's social organization against the failures of authoritarian regimes.
Yeah.
So I would say right about that characterization, because I think it leads to something different.
Yeah, no, I certainly wouldn't characterize it as that. I mean, that's why I mentioned Indonesia and also Turkey, even though there's a lot, I mean, there are huge problems in Turkey, but religious extremism so far is not, it's not characterized by that, even though there are no doubt religious extremists, but Muslim politics are not at all always extremist, of course not. And also, the other thing that I think people lose sight of is that the dictatorships in the Middle East are not the result of religious extremism at all. The dictatorships are failed secular states. They're failed experiments in various forms of fascism and Stalinism and so on. And the religious revolt is precisely against failed secular dictatorships and not against anything else. Yes?
Will you comment on your view of the differences between secularization and secularism?
Oh, secularization, I think, is the erosion of religious belief. In other words, the shrinking of organized faith, people becoming losing their faith, as it were. Whereas secularism is a dogma of an anti-religious dogma, almost that it's almost a faith in a society which is where religion in the public sphere plays no role. And I think those are two different concepts. Yes.
I wonder, earlier you were trying to a question about religion really becoming kind of militarized in the form in the face of oppression from authority. But if you look at the United States and this rise of the new religious right, which largely occurred in the 70s, and at the same time that privatization and great deregulation, this idea of the lack of authority, central authority, lack of central credibility. Do you see this rise of televangelists and megachurches kind of a way of trying to reestablish this authority, like you mentioned in Britain, this kind of need for the church as a symbol for some kind of authority? Do you see the new right, this evangelical movement in the United States as something of trying to reestablish a patriarchal structure or an authoritarian, some kind of center of authority?
Well, it's a very good question. I think that the religious revolts against secular dictatorships are perhaps a slightly different phenomenon from the rise of televangelists and evangelical faiths and so on in the US. The role that's played by religion in secular dictatorships is that it's a bit like the role of the Catholic Church in Poland under communism, is that it's, if you want to mobilize people against a dictatorship, particularly a dictatorship which emphasizes ideological and dogmatic conformity, it helps to have an organized source of a sort of alternative morality. It gives you a sort of moral basis from which to oppose the secular state. That's one pattern, and I think in some ways, that's also what happened in Iran, and not so much, not necessarily because it was an anti-Western phenomenon. I mean, that was part of it, but I think just as political Islam in the Middle East, although it's expressed often in acts of violence against the Western world. The Western world, in a sense, is not the primary target. The primary target are the local elites who are, in the view of the religious, corrupted by Western ways. So by association, as the source of the corruption, the Western world gets implicated and attacked. And I think that was probably true in Iran. Now, the televangelists and so on, I mean, the other reason why people flock to the church as a kind of form of political organization, I think, is fear. And the rise of populism in Europe, anti-Muslim, anti-immigration, and so on, that kind of populism, I think, is not so different from the Tea Party populism that you see here. It's people who are fearful of their position in the modern world. They feel that they've lost their bearings. They don't feel that they're represented by a government that represents their interests. They feel that they've lost a grip on their own lives, and so on. And so they look for a source of authority, yes. And often it can become aggressive, but it's the reason, I think, is fear. It's a kind of almost an existential fear. And that's not quite the same thing as the revolt against the religious revolt against secular dictatorships. Yeah, could you speak up? I can't hear you.
Secularism as a sort of the other extreme that is developed in regards to political extremism. So my first question would be, how do you think, what do you think should be the solution to which is certainly sort of got stuck in, where on one side we have religious extremism, or per se, let's say Islamic extremism nowadays, and then as a result there has, especially in Europe, with regards to politicians like Bill Clinton in Netherlands and then Islam in France and the Khartoum issue and the Q1 issue that has developed post 9/11, and sort of it seems like there's a circle that we're stuck in. The reaction from the religious extremism is the extreme end of secularism, and this new development into people joining the extremism because of a reaction to the secularism is seen as a danger towards their religion, and especially how that is affecting the majority of the Muslims that are not
Right.
part of the religious extremist group.
Right.
And especially post 9/11, where a lot of the Muslims themselves are the majority that has been affected by the Islamic extremism themselves, rather than the Western.
Right.
If you look into Iraq or Pakistan, or even not Pakistan, the populations of those countries themselves that have been affected the most by the extremists rather than
Yes.
anyone else. So how do you think we should
Well, I can answer it perhaps first by saying how it should not be done. It should not be done by seeing Islam per se as a religion as a great threat to Western liberal democracy, because the only way to isolate the violent and extreme element is to have the non-violent Muslims on the side of the liberal democracy. And if you argue that the core problem is not political extremists, but it's the religion itself, then you are in great danger of alienating the very people whom you need on your side. And that means that what you have to make it not only by law, but you have to persuade people that it's entirely legitimate to have people of Muslim background, believing Muslims and so on, who agree to play by the rules of democracy, that they are legitimate players, that there's no contradiction between being a Muslim believer and a good citizen of liberal democracy. And so that's why I brought up Tariq Ramadan, even though I don't agree with a lot of his politics. I think the thinking is going is in the right direction. Now, those who are so orthodox that they simply want to drop out of the whole game, that's not necessarily a danger. It's as long as they don't want to destroy the society around them. And as for the rest, yes, you have to persuade people that they're good citizens, and thus isolate the really extreme and violent element. That's the only way to do it. You can't crush the extremists by sending the Marines in. You can do a lot by policing and intelligence and so on. But in the end, the intelligence and the policing is only going to be effective if the non-violent religious or people of that religious background are on the side of democracy. Yes, absolutely, which is quite, you're right.
So I'm saying that even though ideally we want people to just isolate the extremists from the equation, but it's not what's happening on ground. In Netherlands, the body is gaining a lot of popularity, and that is based on not isolating extremists, but looking at Islam and all this.
Yes.
In general.
Well, absolutely. Well, that's why you have to oppose that party if you're arguing politics in Holland. Well, no, but that's not quite true. I mean, it's not as though they're unopposed. There is a real debate going on. And I think one of the problems of this debate, and I didn't mention that in the talk, but is that partly for various reasons, but the left in Europe that used to be sympathetic to non-Western causes, non-Western people, non-Western cultures, and so on, that large parts of the left have joined the conservatives in opposing Islam per se. I mean, there are examples in the United States of this too. One of the reasons is that the tradition in the left of anti-clericalism. So anything that is religious needs to be opposed from their point of view. The other reason is that much of the European left that came out of the 1960s, many members of the left that came out of the 1960s, aggressively secularist left, themselves came often from religious families, and the turn away from religious conservatism and the fruits of the rebellion of the 1960s, and by that I don't mean just secularism, I mean gay rights, feminism and so on, are so recent that people are terrified of losing that. And they see the Muslim immigrants as a real threat to everything that they fought for in the 1960s and 70s. And so they've ended up, and then there are specific cases which drew the left into the same camp as the cultural conservatives. The murder of Theo van Gogh is, of course, one, but I think the most important one was the burning of the Satanic Verses. Because there you had Salman Rushdie, a member of the metropolitan European left, one of us, as it were, who himself had always championed third world causes against so-called, Western imperialism, neo-colonialism, Western imperialism, and so on. Suddenly he was being attacked by religious youths, and that I think changed a lot of opinions. And so the very people who should be opposing Wilders and other anti-Muslim populists are now actually, even though they wouldn't openly support these groups because that would not be chic, but in some ways they're not very vociferous in their opposition to them because on some fundamental level they agree with them. Does that answer your question?
Well, I mean, I know you can't cover everything, and you chose a place to begin your discussion, but two pretty obvious but important to mention items that are like throwing logs on this fire. One, it's hard to talk about civic virtues when you got, 500,000 troops in Muslim countries, and most of the people who get killed are Muslims. That certainly kind of puts that all in another level. And then even previous to that is when your working class is half Muslim, or whatever proportion it might be in parts of Europe that have an invisible or negative birth rate. If you don't, you can't really import workers and then expect them to leave their minds behind. So, you get what you pay for.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to deal in these manners, if you're going to mess about in one form or another, and the current wars, I don't have to explain to anybody, are just the latest, some ways the most egregious, but not the least, even of some of the things that have been going on for a long time in the Middle East. And this, immigrant stuff, I mean, heck, in Britain, there's immigrant bashing of Poles, big time. And the BNP looks to make a big gain against Poles, of all things. So you don't have to be Muslim to provoke a nationalist response.
No, that's of course true, but I'm not quite sure what the question is.
No, quite. Well, how do you square that circle? What's the point of talking about let's side with the right civic action? Let's oppose the parties of intolerance while these wars continue, or while you don't have a working class and you keep importing strangers into your country.
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, the wars don't help. That's for sure. But I don't think it's quite the source of this, because even if every American soldier were to leave Iraq and Afghanistan, these tensions with immigrants or the children of immigrants would still be there. And the problem is and also guest workers are no longer coming in large numbers. I mean, the borders are now pretty closed, really. But the problem, of course, is not with the so-called guest workers. The immigrants who bring their cultures from these rural areas of Anatolia or Morocco, they're not a problem. Nobody ever had a problem with it. They have their culture, but they didn't play a significant social or political role in society. The problem is with their children and their grandchildren, people born and bred in Europe, and who are in betwixt and between, because they have no roots in these village cultures of their parents, and they feel, some of them don't feel welcome in the countries of their birth. And they're the ones who are attracted to forms of religion which are actually not traditional. I mean, Wahhabism, sponsored by Saudi Arabia, is not a traditional faith. These are all born-again faiths that appeal to children of immigrants precisely because they don't have a long tradition. I mean, they're disseminated on the internet, often in English, and so what we're dealing with is not a clash of cultures or people who've brought in an alien culture. It's a clash of, it's a political clash essentially, and a social one. And that is why I began by saying that I think one of the crucial problems is that people mix all these different issues up in a way that's very unhelpful. I mean, the crime in the streets, intolerant attitudes from non-Western village cultures, religious fundamentalism of various kinds, and political Islam. And these things have to be seen separately. Just as the revolt, the political Islam in the Middle East, in the context of secular dictatorships there, is a separate issue, although linked, but it's a separate issue from the revolt of European Muslims in a European context. I mean, it's linked because it gives people, the Palestinian issue, for example, gives people an emotional context. But if you actually ask Moroccans in Europe, or not only Moroccans, I mean European Muslims, how deeply they really care about the Palestinians, they care as little about the Palestinians as most Arabs care about the Palestinians. But it's a very useful issue. And if it were to disappear, there would be another issue. I mean, again, which is not to say that it helps. On the contrary, it doesn't. It's an added problem. But it's. I think one has to distinguish between these various sources of conflict.
Shall we take one more question?
Okay.
I'm wondering how you see, or if you see, religion facilitating sort of indirectly facilitating violence through, like, for example, like preachers, I mean, telling these like televangelist churches that are vote for Bush is a vote for God, or like Bush saying that freedom is a gift from the Almighty God, and I believe that everybody should be free, and that's part of my foreign policy in order to gain support for like Iraq, like the Iraqi war, or if you see like religion sort of, I don't know, the irrationality, like you said, that faith is, if you see that transferring sort of to a national level at some point.
I'm not entirely sure I follow your question. Whether what will become national?
I don't know, sort of this, that irrationality is sort of to take things at face value or something like that, to take his claims at face value instead of investigating whether or not the war is actually like legitimately, justified, whether or not, like for example, like a third of Americans still believe that Iraq had WMDs,
Right.
a plan for making them, when I mean there have been reports showing that they had used it, and like there's this propensity sort of, you not see like a propensity in the individual to sort of hang on to beliefs or something like that without justifying them.
Well, if your point is that human beings can be very irrational, then that is certainly true. And is the question, how do we deal with irrationality, or?
Yeah, and is that linked, I mean, do you see that as being linked to violence, like in, helping gain support for wars?
It can be, of course. But I mean, the problem with irrationality is that, of course, human beings are irrationality and have all kinds of opinions that are not reasonable. Now, on one level, you argue against unreasonable opinions by using reason, and sometimes you'll persuade people and sometimes you don't. But the main problem begins when people are prepared to use violence to impose their irrational beliefs on others. As long as they don't do that, then it doesn't matter a great deal. I mean, the rest is a question of debate. And I suppose if the question is, how do we deal with the fact that countries can go to war based on all kinds of irrational rhetoric? That was your...
Sort of, yeah. If irrationality sort of fostered by religion is linked to violence on a national.
It can be, but I don't think that, for example, the Iraq War can be really explained entirely as something that was somehow the result of irrational religious beliefs. You're quite right that religion was part of the rhetoric and may have mobilized parts of public opinion behind this war. But my main objection to the war in Iraq was that both in Britain and in the United States, the government was never straightforward about the reasons for doing this. And the one thing a democracy has to do is level with its citizens if they're going to risk the lives of their soldiers, why they're actually doing it. And it's no good being shifty about it if one day it's about weapons of mass destruction and the next day suddenly it's about toppling a dictator and it's for human rights reasons, and another day it's something else. That's a serious problem. But I don't think it can be... There was so much was said and so many lies were spread about reasons for going to that war that you can't really reduce them simply to religious irrationality. I mean, you could just as well say a lot of Americans were persuaded that this was a good war because of the inherent idealism in American society about spreading freedom and democracy in the world. I mean, a lot of people, that is something that plays very well in America and is not an inherently irrational idea. It may be a utopian one, and one that can lead to all kinds of violent consequences. But the idea as such that the world would be a better place if we all lived in democracies is not insane. So I think religious irrationality is maybe one element in the rhetoric that persuaded people at the time that this was a good war, but it's only one of them.
Please join me in thanking Professor Buruma.
Thank you.